Hello, welcome. I'm very delighted to welcome you all to a conversation about international tech governance. It's an issue that is at the forefront of international discussions. President Biden talked about it yesterday at the UN. The G7 is talking about it, the G20. The UK is going to host a summit. And we're discussing issues like how to maintain innovation, how to compete against authoritarians, what countries should be involved in various kinds of governance, how to make sure that the robots don't take over the world. Not small issues. And we couldn't have a better person to talk about this with than Andy Wyckoff. Andy has just completed 33 years at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the mighty organization at the heart of all of this that you'll hear a lot about. Most of that time he spent as the director of the OECD's Directorate for Science, Technology, and Innovation. He represented the OECD in conversations, relationships with the G7 and the G20 on innovation. I first met Andy many years ago. He was one of the storied experts at the US Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, where he had come after serving as an economist at the US National Science Foundation. He's currently recovering as a visiting senior fellow at the European University Institute and a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. As I said, Andy's been on the front lines of international tech governance, not bureaucracy, but governance, and balancing all of these issues that we're dealing with today. So we're really eager to get his thoughts. We're going to have about a 40-minute conversation, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. You'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A, if you could use that, not a chat function. I'll go through those and ask Andy and try to put him on the spot a little bit. So Andy, let's jump right into the issue on everybody's minds and everybody's lips, the issue of AI. The OECD has been working on AI, maybe you'll correct me, at least since 2019, when it developed definitions and principles, a taxonomy. And really that taxonomy undermines both the risk management now at the heart of the NIST principles, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies in the US, that put out a risk management framework that has received a lot of praise, and also the European AI Act, which considers itself a risk-based approach. Now the G7 has announced a Hiroshima process that's going to agree to a code by the end of the year, and it looks like the OECD may be a secretariat for that. Can you tell us, what do you see coming out of this? And more important, what should come out of this?
Good morning, Ambassador Kornbluh. Karen, it's great to be with you. Yeah, so that's a really good quick overview of where OECD is on AI. We started a little bit earlier. So I had the good fortune of being at that 2016 G7 Digital Ministerial in Takasaki, Japan, where, to the Japanese credit, they tabled a document on ethical guidelines for AI R&D. And then they helped support our work there at the OECD, led to a conference, a book, and then, as you said, those principles in 2019, which are really the first intergovernmental set of principles. They went to 36 member countries, 8 more signed on, and then the next month, they went to the G20 and became adopted. They don't have OECD in the name of the G20, but it's word for word the same. And the issue has just continued. And we've been there supporting mainly the G7 and the G20 along the way. The Canadians and the French partnered on global partnership on AI under their G7 presidencies. And then, as you said, here we are with Hiroshima. And with the advent of generative AI and lots of people calling for action, and of course that action just can't be domestic, it has to be international. And I was really impressed that leaders themselves called for this Hiroshima process last May. And the OECD working with the Japanese and the G7 countries, which includes the EU, but also working hand in hand with UNESCO and with GPI. They've all been mandated to try to carry forward the Hiroshima process. And that basically is, can we get to a common position on what we want to do in terms of policy frameworks around generative AI? I think there's still some positioning here around what that's going to look like, but I expect some kind of guidelines or code to come out before the end of the year.
And what do you think should come out? I mean, what kinds of things would you hope? Now, I know this is uncomfortable for you, that you get to, now that you've left your government service, your international government organization service, you get to say what you think as opposed to what all your members think. But what kind of code do you think is reasonable to come out?
Well, there have been the principles we did in 2019 provide kind of a high level issues, issues such as accountability. What does that mean? Security, issues of transparency, and so forth. I think what you saw come out of the White House over the summer, where President Biden, OSTP, working with a bunch of tech companies, produced their principles. Again, these are voluntary.
Let me interrupt you. I mean,
Yeah.
so that's the big criticism, that not only were they voluntary of the criticism of what came out of the White House, they were voluntary, but they also didn't even have timeframes or quantification around them. So it'd be very hard for domestic regulators in the US to hold them to account for meeting those voluntary commitments. Do you see a problem with a sort of voluntary code at the international level? Would you hope that that would be sort of implemented at the country level in a way that's more specific, or is that too much to expect?
Yeah. No, I think the time has come. We need to move beyond voluntary and codes and industry voluntary agreements. I think we do need some legislation, and I'm happy to see it. I give the Europeans credit for pushing the issue, at least at the OECD table. That's, I think, stimulated other countries, and you see the US talking about it quite actively now, but also Canada, Brazil. And personally, I think that,
and even China.
Yeah, well, yeah, China, and to some degree, when you look at China's, with the exception of kind of it's all about the state, those are consistent with some of the other proposals we're seeing. And so, yeah, I think it's time to move. And you hear the tech companies even say this, that they want it too. Now, I get a little bit cynical about why they may want it, but in any event, I think the time has come. I'm a little bit worried by the legislative process in the US. You know more about that than I do. The EU has also hit a few road bumps along the way. We're kind of iterating now between the three different groups in Brussels and Strasbourg and elsewhere. But progress is going forward.
But how would you see that? So would the Hiroshima process come out with something that's sort of voluntary and suggestive, and then the individual countries would have to make it into something more than voluntary? Or how do you see that playing out? Is there any reference point, any other issue we've dealt with in this way?
Yeah. So the G7 has put out more binding things. You've seen them more on issues of exchange rates and issues of military
Protectionism. Yeah.
Right. And so I'd love to see it go to that level. I'm got a clear bias here. I like to see them task international organizations such as the OECD to follow up, implement, and hold people accountable. We're pretty good at naming and shaming, and I think that's what needs to be done. But again, I think something along the more legislative lines would be good. I do think there's another process. Those 2019 OECD AI principles have an automatic review clause after 5 years, and that will start in 2024. And here, I think the Hiroshima process will feed into that, or vice versa. And hopefully those guidelines, those principles will become a little bit more implemented in practice and rooted in specifics than where they were in 2019.
So let me unpack that a little bit. If the OECD has a role in sort of being a kind of secretariat, does that limit? I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Does that limit the applicability or even the legitimacy? Because there's the OECD is criticized by some as being the rich man's club. In other words, it's the organization that it's unlike the UN. It has a limited number of members, and they're traditionally the richer countries. And then others see it as yet another sclerotic, consensus-based international institution. So I know the OECD is undergoing a lot of change, but I don't know that our audience does. So maybe you can talk about that.
Well, you're right. It's not the UN. It does not have global membership, but I think it's wrong now in 2023 to characterize it as the rich man's club.
Tell us why. Yeah.
Well, Turkey and Mexico have been members for a long time, hardly up there with Luxembourg or Switzerland. And new members have just come in, Colombia, Costa Rica for 2, again, more middle or lower. And then there's an accession process underway where 6 new countries are acceding to become members, and they include countries like Argentina, Brazil, importantly, Croatia, Peru, Romania. And the big news just recently was the signal from Indonesia that they wanted to join. It would start some type of official process. Now, I don't know where that is. The OECD Council has to agree on it, but boy, if I was there, I would be pushing hard. I think that would be good. I think they could use more Southeast Asian members. And so, okay, it's becoming more worldly. But it's not global. But the good news is that you have much more what they call like-mindedness. You can get things done and internationally and get what I call kind of the snowball going. Okay, you get those countries agreeing to it, and then you take it elsewhere. And so the OECD principles, I think we were working hand in hand with UNESCO on their AI ethical principles. We work closely, particularly now, with the ITU. And so I think there's opportunity there to join up with what the UN is doing and hopefully take what is tested at one level with a certain set of countries and then roll it out more globally. Now, I do think they need to be modified a little bit for some parts of the world. We currently don't have any African members, but the Global Partnership on AI, which is hosted at the OECD, does have Egypt, Senegal, and other countries, India, importantly, as part of its membership. And that's quite literally right down the hall from the official OECD Secretariat.
Great. And just sticking with this issue of AI, I mean, we've mostly been talking about the kinds of guardrails that, our civilian uses and, have to do with consumer uses of AI. But there's a lot of talk about, do we need some kind of arms control framework for the worst case uses, the military uses, or the AI that's, run amok and trying to take over the world. And you recently gave a talk in Geneva where you addressed some of these proposals, where we had to think about worst case scenarios. What can you tell us what you're thinking about that question and problem?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's a very interesting problem. Over the summer, a number of proposals have come out. I think you're familiar with them, talking about the need for really new global institutions that would perform this function, along the lines of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or even IPCC, the Intergovernmental Climate Change Group from the UN. I think those are great ambitions. That's a great ideal. I just look at the geopolitics in 2023. We got a kind of a containment going on. It was reminiscent of my youth. And then you got a really hot war, not too far from where I'm sitting today. And I just say, wow, under what timeline are we going to get those new institutions when you can't even get really the traction we need on the climate change and the Paris Agreement? And so what I did in Geneva, I proposed kind of an interim, what I call Plan B, which was exactly the snowball idea. Hey, let's take some existing mechanisms that have proven themselves to be able to work, including the G7, the OECD, the GPI, the Trade and Technology Council between the EU and the US now. And can we use those to begin to perform some of these functions that these authors suggest, such as we need a CERN for AI, so to give greater access to that type of heavy compute that's needed. And for me, I think that's not a bad idea for an organization like ITU or even UNESCO to move to, or maybe even GPI, pooling some of the centers that already exist around the world. But listen, I do think something needs to be done. It just needs to be done quickly. And that's why I propose this more interim solution.
Interim solution of using existing multilaterals.
Yep.
Yeah,
And
it's interesting. I almost get the sense when people are proposing these grand new institutions that, first of all, they don't understand how hard it is. These require treaties. And secondly, there seems to be a grab bag of three that people know about. Tell us a little bit about some of the other organizations that are under the umbrella of the OECD treaty, and if people are skeptical about whether an institution can be nimble and actually accomplish things, what some of these other related institutions to the OECD do.
yeah, I think people don't. The OECD hosts a number of different groups, as you know, and it does have great flexibility for what's it's an organization.
I mean, so tell people, so FATF,
Yeah,
the
it's
Financial Action Task Force
that looks at money laundering. We've got the Global Partnership on AI, which tries to turn those principles into practice. That's hosted at the OECD. We've got the Blue Dot Group, which has been US led about types of investment. You know that the IEA sprung out of
International Energy Agency, where we coordinate releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Yeah.
Right. And kind of when you look at some of the discussions about critical minerals and the supply chain needed for both semiconductors and so forth, that isn't far from the IEA mission right now. And some of their green work begins to look at those critical minerals within an energy lens. I'm just saying there's parts of the OECD, a trade group, science, technology, and innovation that are looking at the semiconductor chain as well, and how to build out more resilience, more diversity. So, yeah, and all that's new, a lot. And now there's discussion, as you probably know, coming out of the G7 about institutionalizing something at the OECD on data flows.
Oh yeah, I was going to get to that, but go right ahead. Yeah, really interested. No, go ahead. Tell us about the OECD process, which, so I should say, first of all, let me give the advertisements for GMF. So at GMF, we put out a proposal to create something like the IEA or use the IEA to deal with these issues of critical minerals and rare earth elements, not only in the energy context, but also in the semiconductor context. And also, we host the Global Task Force on Trusted Data Flows. Julie Brill of Microsoft and I co-chair that. It's got global experts and civil society members and industry members as well. And, everyone we talk to has only the most wonderful things to say about the OECD process on compelled data access that, from what I understand, but you can tell us more, really brought together intelligence community leaders and data protection leaders in a really unique kind of conversation that surprisingly hadn't happened before, despite all the conflict, especially since the Snowden revelations.
No, I think you're right. I think we were all very pleasantly surprised that got landed in late in 2022. And kudos to my old colleague Audrey Plonk, who really wrestled that one to the ground. But she had a lot of help just to say, yeah, you're right. It started with Schrems 1, Schrems 2. These are European Court of Justice rulings that invalidated the data flows between Europe and the United States, which kind of was a result of the Snowden revelations. And to me, this is kind of the Gordian knot a little bit to getting data flows really working, at least across a group of countries who share the same values and have the similar type economies. And you just think of the amount of data that must flow across the Atlantic to operate something like BMW subsidiaries and where is it, Alabama, I think. And so this was a real issue. And you're right. I think one of the advantages of the OECD is we've got almost every policy area under one relatively small roof. And so we were able to bring different communities together. So not only the data protection authorities, but the security and the intelligence community. And with the lifting of COVID, it was a face-to-face meeting. We had a breakthrough, which then resulted in a declaration, which was part of the ministerial meeting that happened last December in Gran Canaria in Spain. And I think this hopefully will provide wind in the sails, momentum for carrying this work forward and begin to pick off other pieces of the data flow puzzle, which I think, and this is really the notion behind institutionalizing something that's called the IAP, Institutional Arrangement for Partnership, hopefully at the OECD.
That the Japanese through the G7 have asked to be created. Yeah.
And again, I got to give a little bit of a shout out to Japan too. I think they're the unsung heroes in a lot of this. It's a very proud, but a very humble and modest society, as you know. But you can tell 2016 Takasaki, here we are with Hiroshima, and then with the data flows work. I think they've been really pushing this in a very good way. And so, yeah, I keep my fingers crossed. I think it's going to be a long-term work, though. I mean, it's going to be piece by piece. You begin to fit something together, but I think the OECD is the right place to do it. And the work last year.
One more unpacking on that. What was important? I mean, I think I have a sense, but I want you to share with the audience. What was important about getting the intelligence community folks and the data protection folks from all these different countries together? Well, what did that lead to?
Right. No, I think it led to a better recognition of each other's positions and why they were saying what they were doing. It led to some common terminology because previously they've been kind of talking past each other, and it led to some pressure on both groups.
So just to, I'll be the American for a second. Yeah. So, one of the frustrations that I think Americans have is that they feel that we actually have procedures that theoretically that constrain the intelligence community in what they can do, and that some of the countries that are pushing back on the US maybe do some of the same things with different rules. And now I think those other countries would push back and say, well, we don't have the telecommunications, the internet networks that you all have, so it's not apples and apples. But still, I think there's a US frustration that what lies on the surface of these debates is not really fair to what goes on. And what I've heard anyway is that this conversation got folks to a little bit more apples to apples conversation. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. I don't want to stick out my neck too far here, but just, yeah, I think it led to a greater appreciation of some of the mechanisms U.S. had in place. But bear in mind, there were revelations about bugging Angela Merkel's phone. Okay, I mean, but on the other hand, also maybe a awareness that they didn't have some of these same mechanisms. And that's really what the declaration was moving towards, was kind of recognition of this. I would like to see that declaration be followed up, more than just nice words, but just kind of, can we begin to look at implementation of that as well? But we'll
commercial for GMF, we're putting out with Alex Joel, who's at American University. He's hard at work on the last draft of a paper where we lay out, as a result of this task force discussion, some implementation ideas. Yeah, roadmap. So yeah, stay tuned.
well. Yeah.
Stay tuned. So I want to ask you about this global, what is it called? I'm going to get it wrong. The Global Forum on Technology. I think, did it come out of the UK?
Yeah.
Tell us about what that's supposed to address. There are a lot of other tech issues besides data and AI. Is that where they fall?
Well, yeah. I mean, in short, is better than most that there's this gap between where the technology is and innovation is occurring, and where policy and policymakers are. And the idea is, can we begin to narrow that gap? And I think that has begun to happen on AI. So, there's lots of discussions for a long time. Awareness has risen, and now you've got, I think, still there's a gap, but there's awareness and the need to close it. And so this is more what it's called upstream or anticipatory technology governance, where you begin to look at large, important technologies coming at us that you think need to begin to have some guardrails put around them early. And that's exactly what this Global Forum on Technology, launched and supported by the UK, is intended to do at the OECD. And some of the technologies they're going to look at are immersive technologies, Meta. They're going to look at quantum computing, and they're going to look at synthetic biology, and which I think are three really good ones to start on. And again, the OECD has support and competence in these areas, work underway. So yeah, I'm hopeful this begins to provide an international place to come together and discuss these technologies and begin to look at the opportunities and the challenges.
So I have two more questions, and then I hope people will submit some questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of their screen, because it's nice for me to hear my own voice, but I'd like to hear from some others. I remember, we're talking a lot about guardrails, but I remember something that you said to me when I was ambassador to the OECD, and I was talking about, how the US had to do more to get more productive and be more innovative. And you said, everyone from the US is always, oh, woe is me about the state of the US economy. But every country I go to asks me, how do I build a Silicon Valley? And the US has something really special in its innovation engine. And the key thing is to keep it going. Tell us a little bit about the OECD's role in working with countries around the globe on innovation, and what insights do you have about, what's necessary? What are the necessary, what do you tell people in other countries about the most important things they need to do to spur innovation?
Okay, yeah, but you're right. I think sometimes the US underestimates its gigantic capabilities, and just the world-class universities. The scale and this is really what Europe lacks, although they've been trying to get beyond that, but there's limits. A lot of these countries like their sovereign borders still, and I don't blame them, but this makes it hard to get to a critical mass of R&D, such as what the US has. I think so that's one thing. R&D, we've been studying it, the OECD, since 1963. We have the measurement manual called Frascati, but it's still really important. And I in Geneva, I showed a figure that many people were a little amazed by, that your big 5 tech firms now do as much R&D as the whole country of Germany, public and private. And That's just a scale we haven't seen before, in my mind. So another thing is focusing that R&D. This is what's mission-oriented innovation policies become very popular now, particularly to try to help address climate issues. But it's also, I think, a bit of a reflection of some of the successes the U.S. has had on their various missions, whether led by Department of Defense or NIH or other agencies. But at the end of the day, Karen, I think it's two things. It's about the brains. This is what most of R&D goes for, is paying salaries. And it's that highly qualified personnel. And again, those world-class universities, I think, really help. I just think the U.S. needs to be aware of that and protect them. There's been some sliding, I think, particularly on some public funding of public universities. And then the other one is having the right regulatory environment. And, your risk capital that you have is, again, the envy of the world. And that doesn't really exist yet in Europe. You see a lot of U.S. venture capitalists coming over, which, again, doesn't please Europeans always, because a lot of those firms end up sometimes migrating back to the U.S. or being purchased by U.S. firms. And so I'd say those are the big three. And it's just about being able to look at the forefront and kind of commercialize from the lab to the marketplace. Again, Europe is pretty good on coming up with some world-class ideas, but just has more difficulty taking them into the marketplace. Likewise, countries like Canada are a real powerhouse on AI, but don't have yet a big firm such as those in the US.
Yeah, so that's a great, really interesting set of things that you just said. Stick with that last one. What do you make of countries? If the US has this huge lead in AI and generative AI, are other countries just going to be permanently, the worst case scenario, you hear about this like data colonialism, we're going to suck up other people's data. The US is going to be the one benefiting, and then we're going to sell the fruits to other countries. And then you hear, no, it's like electricity, and it's going to just be an enabling technology that's going to allow all kinds of innovation in a bunch of different countries. And then you also see a country like France, which says, you know what, hey, we think we're gonna get in this game ourselves as try to have a foundational role. How do you see this new world of AI playing out, I guess, geopolitically?
So those are great questions, and I don't know if my crystal ball is really up for them, but I think that there's some conflicting trends. The one is, these large models just take so much computing power that only a few entities around the world can really amass that type of computing power, and it's expensive. So that would be a barrier to entry. On the other hand, you begin to see these models then become kind of more open sourced, and there are techniques for taking that existing foundational model and running it with a different set of, tweaking it for your own special needs, which is much more approachable for anybody to do. But still, at the end of the day, that big model had roots in U.S. tech. I have some sympathy with the desire, particularly by Africa, which has different values. The data that these models trained on certainly wasn't African data. It comes with these biases, which we probably don't know. And that's why I think the idea in these papers over the summer for like a more world approach, kind of a CERN for AI, isn't such a bad idea. Again, it will take time and a lot of money. But no, but I agree with you about what we call general purpose technology, like electricity. And you just see it every day. The the applications being used, whether it be in healthcare or in environmental issues, or as you mentioned, dual use military uses, it's spreading throughout the economy. And so I think everyone, I think companies in almost every sector will benefit from this technology, and it may help reinvent some older sectors that maybe need to be brought in the 21st century.
Great. I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have been submitted. This first one is kind of long, but I think instead of summarizing it, I'm just going to read it. It's from Antonio Martinez. The technological change is so accelerated that it has exceeded the adaptation capacity of our institutional and legal architecture in charge of coordinating the actions necessary by our democratic political structure to adapt them to change in the technological paradigm. I think what he's saying is the change is so fast, has our state capacity, our democratic capacity kept up? And then we have to add I'm summarizing, the challenge of China and Russia that are taking advantage of these circumstances to weaken democratic government structures. How can we reconfigure our political architecture, economic and technological architectures to overcome the period of adjustment? I think that's an interesting question. So he's saying, I think that in the neoliberal era, no, he's not even saying it was weakened before. He's saying the technological change is weakening the state structures, and we're vulnerable right now, both, I guess, to the technological change, but also China and Russia taking advantage of this period of transition.
Well, I'm almost tempted to flip this back to you, because some of the work you've been doing at GMF has been exactly on how technology is the interplay with democracy. But I worry about I kind of agree with some of the criticisms that existing mechanisms may not be enough, that we may need new mechanisms to deal with this, and we need to have them be properly funded and staffed and so forth, because it can't just take kind of existing bureaucrats, and you need some really skilled people to help with this. But in terms of more authoritarian
and authorities, I mean, they need authorities and skill. Yeah.
But again, you're beginning to see it at pretty high levels, leaders saying, yes, let's do this. In terms of the more authoritarian governments using this, that worries me. And about the only thing and I think this is where some of the alarm bells begin to ring, and calls for a moratorium and so forth, partly to slow down the process so we can catch up. The OECD doesn't deal with military or security, so that's a little bit out of my bailiwick, but I have those concerns myself. So that's why, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but just kind of go back to the can we snowball? We need something pretty quickly in place that hopefully will show some leadership that other countries can get behind, as opposed to going to the other side.
That's interesting. So Ken Jarbo asked a question. I'm just gonna pick at the heart of what he lists a bunch of issues that we haven't really addressed in full, and I'll let you take your pick of which ones you want to speak to. The first one is about trade. He says, with the resurgence of industrial policy, trade and technology, including technology protectionism. So that's one issue. Productivity, he says, he raises, including the OECD work on lagging versus leading companies. Love to hear you talk about that. And then some of the OECD work on emergence of knowledge-based, intangible-based economy. So, any of those that you'd like to talk about, your insights based on the OECD work.
Yeah, I know Ken, he's a source of some pretty hard questions. And so just quickly on the sovereignty issue, or what some are calling strategic autonomy, you're beginning to see a revival. I don't know if we call it industrial policy. We're going to update it to call it industrial strategy, which is a little bit less about national champions, a little bit broader, but it does talk about the need for some resilience and not being dependent on countries that may have a lockhold on some of this. It's about looking at choke points that you don't want to hit, and so I think you're beginning to see that evolve. I'd love to be able to say that at least there should be agreements about this across the OECD, 38 members and more coming in about some rules of the game there, just to keep trade the beneficial force that it's been. Now, Ken rightly knows there's great work done by colleagues at the OECD looking at productivity, and they're looking below the aggregates because the aggregate is rather weak productivity growth, but this conceals some that are just doing very, very well. Some firms, the best, and then the rest, as the title of the paper goes. And there's a question, this gap seems to be growing over time. There's been a lot of work to try to explain why that's happening. Certainly, I think intangibles are part of this, and there's a great work done by professor in BU, Jim Besson, who on this, and just to say that these intangibles are things like R&D, it's software, it's knowing how to deal with vast amounts of data and extract insights from it. It's about attracting really skilled personnel to work in your firm. And these things just don't diffuse the way a machine tool would diffuse. And so
you're not saying that the productivity numbers are wrong, because some people have said that the productivity doesn't capture this. You're saying that its diffusion is holding back productivity.
Yeah, this is a longer conversation. I'd always say that
all day.
the productivity numbers aren't perfect because it's really hard to capture some of the quality improvements with this technological change. And the statisticians try their best, and the US again has been pretty upfront on that. But it's just, you know, the difference between ChatGPT 3 and 4 is gigantic. How do you capture that? I wish them luck. But just to say that, so let's just accept the productivity numbers, which are the best I think we can get. And it's really looking below those aggregates at the dispersion across firms. And there you see a huge variance. And yes, Ken, I do worry that those who master AI and how to use it in their firm processes will see yet again another real bump up. Interesting paper, then I'll stop, out of, Microsoft owns GitHub, which is a code sharing site where programmers go to swap routines. Well, they now have a new function called Copilot, which is basically AI, a large language model, but on code. And they just did a study where they came out with remarkable improvements in programmer productivity, coder productivity, by using this new generative AI tool. 56%, which we're happy with, 3 or 4% productivity growth. That's remarkable. I'd want to look at the paper more closely, but even if it's half, that's a big jump.
Great. Maybe we'll figure out a way to send out these papers or put them on the website so people can find them. And I hope people will submit some more questions. I've got 2 on AI coming up, but I'd love to get some more. One is, how do you see the future of the hybrid systems, meaning AI with human support?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the work, both at the OECD and other organizations, have been about what's called human-centered AI. And that is always having human in the loop. And I think that's part of the code of conduct that you might see emerge, which is you need to have sign off by a human. and you just can't rely on the automaticity of the system. Now, this is important for many reasons, but I just think that it will hopefully lead to more of a complementary relationship with people, as opposed to what some people fear is kind of a substitute. And so far, there's again a lot of speculation of what the labor impacts might be of this. But everything I've seen so far is largely complementary. But believe it or not, the official numbers I've seen too on diffusion are lower than most people think. And so we're still at the experimentation phase of a lot of this. But let me just segue a second into, I think this is again one of the, I have a bias, but beauties of the OECD. This work has now gone out from the Directorate of Science, Technology, and Innovation to the Directorate on Education, where they're doing really interesting work about how AI works with schooling, to the Directorate of Employment, Labor, and Social Affairs, where they're looking at work impacts, but also how it's used in the health sector. And then this allows kind of a drilling down on specific issues, and STI is doing this on risk, building an incidents database of incidents with AI to try to be able to calibrate risk frameworks with real data. And again, I think this is the long-term kind of tough statistical work, which the OECD is known for, which it has a real comparative advantage in doing. But yeah, I think human in the center is the focus of a lot of this work across the OECD, and hopefully we'll stay there.
So we have another question that goes back to the earlier question. Maybe you can put a finer point on it. How can the OECD eventually work with China, or can the OECD work with China within the framework of the G20 to reach common rules on AI? So I think you were referencing a snowball effect. Why don't you unpack that a bit and talk about, because a lot of people are not familiar with how the G7 works, the G20 works, how the OECD works with it. These other, it's not obvious at all for anyone who's confused. It's an art, not a science.
Yeah, and there's a few untold stories, maybe unwritten, but just very quickly, both of these groups, the presidency rotates from one country to another, typically lands on government officials who already have a full plate. And so what the OECD does is they step in and offer to provide support to the country who has the presidency of the G20 or the G7. And OECD has been active in the G20 since 2008, and almost as long with the G7, which I think you've seen the G7 more from truly a discussion amongst world leaders, kind of unstructured, to now much more of a programmed approach with tracks that continue from one year to another. So long story short, China, it's a really interesting question. And I'm happy I can talk about that having left the OECD, because there's not a absolutely clear position at the OECD. It depends on the issue area, how engaged or welcoming they are. But to me, on global problems like climate change and AI, you really need to have a dialogue with them. And so I think opening maybe a little bit more informal backdoor channels to universities and researchers at the technical level would be a really healthy thing. I see the UK AI Safety Summit. The UK intends to invite China. That's a positive, I think, sign. You see some thawing as the US officials visit China more frequently. But I also think China needs to recognize the importance of engaging genuinely in some of these processes. Just to end, in 2019, they held the presidency of the G20, and that's when 2016. but they were joined the Japanese in 2019 with those AI principles, and so I think it's possible. I did mention, and you know as well, geopolitics have changed a lot since 2019.
Oh yeah. So the people in the audience saved the hard questions for last. Here's one. AI relies on scraping the intellectual content of the web. The major players in AI are for-profit entities. What is your thinking about the private use and gain of content that has been generated by others? Is OECD thinking about this dimension of AI?
So, to my knowledge, we're not. The OECD is not. It really comes down to intellectual property rules and interpretation. And the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, tends to have that mandate. I do know there's some court cases going forward, both in the EU, I think in the US, on this exact issue. Be interesting to watch those and how they get decided. I take the point. There's a lot of proprietary content on the web.
And then the other question is, what is your assessment of how successful some of the new multilateral, including NATO initiatives are to spur innovation? What do you think the promise is?
Yeah, I'm less familiar with the NATO initiative than I should for the reasons I kind of outlined before. I think it goes to some of these trying to push some NATO members to devote more to defense spending, and that would include R&D and tech build out and better use of dual use technologies. I think you're beginning to see that spending ramp up. It's nowhere near what the U.S. does or some other countries, but I think it's moving in that direction. That part of NATO, oddly enough, is right down the street in Paris at Neuilly-sur-Seine, and my part of the OECD would talk to that part, the S&T part. So I think there's cooperation there, and as we talked about before, the innovation process is the same to some degree, whether it's a civilian or a military, or as a lot of we're talking about today, it's dual use. I mean, the origin of the semiconductor was DoD sponsored out in California a long time ago.
So just to sum up, we have 7 minutes left. Just taking a step back, you've been on the front lines of this international debate about technology, and you've studied some of the best literature. We went through, there was a huge pivot point with the commercialization of the internet, and then another with social media. And it's certainly, it's hard to know as you go through it, to realize as you go through it, how much change has come about. I mean, just think about, the travel industry, the taxi industry, the hotel industry, to say nothing of journalism, of Hollywood, enormous upheaval, good and bad, and I wonder what you think, if you've seen any good assessments that sort of make any sense of that, but more important, how do you compare the pivot point where we are now, and what are some of the things we can do to get the most? This is just an open-ended question. I'm just framing it my way. You should say whatever you want. But one of the things I think about, maybe I should put it this way, is how do we make sure that we get more of the good? Not that we didn't get a ton of good. I mean, I just took an Uber, to get to an appointment I probably couldn't have gotten to. I'm grateful for all of the empowering technologies that have come down the pike. But as we pivot forward and we have arguably even more change, what do we need to think about to get more of the good and less of the bad? I think people too often think, well, you're going to get the innovation or you're not. But I know you're a more subtle thinker than that.
Yeah, no, when you think about just the conversation we're having across the Atlantic right now, is not wouldn't happen a decade ago. Okay. And, or if it would have been really clunky and expensive. And I think I feel really privileged having had the job in Paris, and at OTA, for that matter, just to be able to be paid to observe what has been just the technology of our lifetimes. And I'm just amazed that it continues to evolve and roll and innovate. I mean, just when you think it's over, it keeps going. And you're right. We both have children. They have no idea what the analog equivalent is of many of the things that they do. And in many cases, there's not. And I think this is just a reflection that we've gotten so used to it in our daily lives. I do think from a policy perspective, we got it right at the beginning in the 90s with kind of the light-handed, let this roll attitude with some very wide guardrails. We may have dropped the ball. I'll be interested in your thoughts after the dot-com bust and the consolidation that occurred, and then the advent of smartphones, which kind of was a big twist that I think we're still recovering from in terms of the consolidation that occurred and some of the impacts of social media and just the data-driven economy, which I don't think even some of the tech firms saw until they realized what they had. So, but again, there's a lot of innovation coming from that data. And you wouldn't have AI as it is today, generative AI, if they didn't have the whole web and that explosion that occurred to harvest and to train on. And so there's a lot of serendipity out there to innovation, which you just can't predict. And just twists in the road that when a dominant firm you think is going to be on forever gets blindsided. And we've seen it with, we know BlackBerry and that story. I grew up in the shadows of Rochester, New York, and Kodak came and went. And now you're seeing some real challenge with new startups. So yeah, it's a really hard balance to get about how do you keep it right so innovation keeps occurring, because we probably need AI desperately to solve some of the global challenges we're facing. But at the same time, there is this kind of asymmetrical risks of, there's a good side, and then those same tools could be used to, and you've heard the nightmare scenarios of the biological weapons and other uses, deep fakes, particularly as our democratic processes are already under some strain. So yeah, sorry, I'm not really answering your question exactly. I am just amazed that
you will in your new life, in your new scholarship. So we're gonna.
Yeah.
This has been amazing. Thank you so much for taking us on a tour of all these different issues. We couldn't stump you. We tried, and we're right in the middle of all this, and it's great to hear your thoughts from where you've come from, all that you've seen. And it's going to be really exciting to hear about some of your work now as you absorb this all and reflect on some of these challenges. So thank you very, very, very much for all your service and for sharing some of it with us today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation, and keep up the good work, Karen.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.